Ever met like an AI that can just pick up a brand new skill just by looking at a couple of examples?
Yeah, like just showing it a few things and boom, it gets it.
It'd be like if you showed a really, really smart student a few solved problems.
And then suddenly they can tackle a whole new set of problems they've never even seen before.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today.
This incredible ability of large language models.
It's called in-context learning, or ICL for short.
And it is mind-blowing when you really think about it. These LLMs, they're kind of showing us a whole new way of thinking about how machines can learn.
They're learning without that traditional, months and months of training data. It's like instant understanding just from context.
It really is. And we're going to unpack exactly how this works in this deep dive today.
We've gone through a ton of research on this.
Oh, yeah.
Papers from the ACL anthology, really insightful blog posts on Prompt Hub, a fantastic beginner's guide from Lakera AI.
Even dove into some lively debates over on Reddit in the machine learning community.
Yeah, those threads, those get pretty intense sometimes.
It's intense, but informative. Lots of different perspectives out there. But zooming out, what we want to do today, for you, the learner, is to give you that clear understanding of ICL.
Like, what are the mechanisms behind it? What makes it tick?
What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? Where's the research heading?
Yeah, we want to give you a complete, insightful overview of in-context learning.
Exactly.
All right, let's start with the basics. What exactly is in-context learning? If you had to explain it simply.
In the simplest terms, it's the ability of these large language models to learn new tasks simply by seeing a few examples right there in the prompt.
Okay, so the context is the prompt, and that's where we give the model those examples.
Yes, exactly. The context is key here. Think of it as showing the model what to do rather than telling it.
Okay, so it's not like we're fine-tuning the model. We're like tweaking its settings and training it on new data.
Yeah, you got it. Fine-tuning involves updating the model's parameters, actually changing its internal workings based on new information. But with in-context learning, nothing like that is happening.
It's all about how the model uses those examples on the fly to figure out what to do.
That's the magic of it. It's relying on the knowledge that's already baked into the model from its initial pre-training.
So it's less about adding new information and more about activating existing knowledge in a new way.
Yes, precisely. And those few examples, they're like the key that unlocks that potential.
Now, I've also heard the term prompt learning thrown around. Is that basically the same thing?
It's related, but not exactly the same. Prompt learning is a broader umbrella.
Okay.
It encompasses all sorts of techniques for guiding the model's behavior using prompts.
Okay.
In-context learning is like a specific flavor of prompt learning where we use those input-output examples, the demonstrations.
Gotcha. So ICL is like a subset of prompt learning.
You could say that, yes. Some researchers even see ICL as a type of prompt tuning, because those examples in the prompt are the key to steering the model's response.
Interesting. Now, we've also talked about few-shot learning before on the show. Is that just another name for ICL?
Ah, good question. They both deal with learning from limited data, but there's a subtle but crucial difference.
Right.
Traditional few-shot learning in machine learning often involves at least a tiny bit of parameter tweaking, even if it's very minimal adjustments.
Okay.
But the ICL we're discussing here, it operates directly on the pre-trained model. There are absolutely zero parameter updates happening.
So the model is using what it already knows based on those examples.
Exactly. It's about unlocking that pre-existing knowledge in a very targeted way without any specialized training for that particular task.
Gotcha. So it's like the model has this huge library of knowledge, and ICL is how we tell it, okay, focus on this section for this specific task.
That's a great analogy.
So how does this actually work? Like, what's going on under the hood when we feed the model those examples? How does it use them to come up with an answer?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's a very active area of research.
Yeah.
But one key piece of the puzzle seems to be something called the scoring function.
Okay.
So you give the model a prompt with examples and a new question.
Right.
And the model needs to figure out the most likely answer. The scoring function is how the model takes its internal guesses and ranks them.
So it assigns a score to each potential answer based on how probable it thinks that answer is.
Exactly.
Okay. So how does the model do that scoring? Are there like different ways to do it?
There are a few different approaches. One common one is called the direct method.
Okay.
It's pretty straightforward. The model basically looks at the prompt and then it calculates how likely it is that the answer words would come next.
So if the prompt is about, I don't know, classifying animals, and you give it an example of a cat, and then you ask it to classify a new animal, it's looking at how likely the words cat, dog, bird, whatever, would follow that prompt.
Exactly. That's the gist of it. It's a very efficient method, computationally speaking.
Okay.
But it can be a bit finicky about how you format the prompt. Often it wants the answer to be right there at the end.
Okay, so you got to structure the prompt just right. What are some other methods?
Another common approach is called perplexity. It's often shortened to PPL.
PPL, okay.
You can think of perplexity as a measure of how surprised the model is by a sequence of words.
Surprised.
Yeah, like if you gave the model a completely nonsensical sentence, it would be very surprised.
Right, it would have high perplexity.
Exactly. But if you give it a sentence that makes sense, it would have lower perplexity.
Got it. So lower perplexity basically means the model thinks that sequence is more probable.
You got it. And in the case of ICL, the model is looking at the entire sequence. The examples, the question, and the potential answer.
Okay, so it's taking everything into account.
Yes, and that makes it a bit more versatile in terms of prompt design. You don't have to be as strict about the structure.
But it probably takes more computational power to calculate that perplexity score, right?
That is a trade-off, yes. It can be a bit more computationally expensive.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you also mentioned a channel model. How is that different?
The channel model. This one's a bit unique.
Okay.
Instead of predicting the answer given the question,
Right.
it kind of flips things around. It asks, how likely would the original question be if this particular answer was correct?
So it's kind of working backwards in a way?
You could say that, yes. It's a bit like reverse engineering the thought process.
Interesting. Why would you use that approach?
It can be really helpful when you have unbalanced data where some answers are just less common. Because it's not just focused on predicting the most common answer, it's looking at the relationship between the question and the answer.
I see. But it probably also takes more computation, right?
Right.
Because it has to kind of reconstruct the entire input in a sense.
You're absolutely right. It's not the most efficient method, but it can be very powerful in certain situations.
So there are different ways for the model to judge how good an answer is based on the context we give it.
Precisely.
But are these methods perfect?
That's a really important question. And honestly, right now, we don't have a definitive answer.
Okay.
Most of these scoring functions, they just use the raw probabilities that the LLM spits out.
Right.
And those probabilities, they might not always be a perfect reflection of the actual likelihood.
I see. So there could be some hidden biases in those probabilities, or the model might be overconfident in some cases.
Exactly. That's why there's a lot of ongoing research into developing better scoring functions that are more robust and reliable.
Okay, so beyond the scoring, how does the model actually learn from those examples we give it? Is it like memorizing what we show it, or is something more sophisticated happening?
The current thinking is that it's definitely more than just rote memorization.
Okay.
The leading theory is that ICL is all about learning by analogy.
Learning by analogy.
Yeah, like think of it this way. You see a few examples of how to sort different colored blocks.
Okay.
And then even though you've never seen those specific blocks before, you can use that same logic to sort a new set of blocks.
Right. You understand the underlying principle and you can apply it to new situations.
Exactly. And that's what we think LLMs are doing with ICL. They're extracting those underlying patterns and principles from the examples.
That's really interesting. Is there like a theoretical framework for understanding how this learning by analogy happens?
There are several theoretical ideas being explored right now. One popular one is the Bayesian inference framework. This basically suggests that when an LLM does ICL, it's using those examples in the prompt to kind of focus its attention on the relevant concepts it already learned during its initial training.
So it's not learning something entirely new. It's more like refining its understanding of something it already knows.
You got it. The prompt acts like a filter, helping the model sift through its vast knowledge and zero in on what's important for the current task.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not actually changing its internal parameters, but rather just focusing its attention in a different way.
Exactly. And this idea, it's pretty consistent with the fact that, ICL doesn't involve any parameter updates.
Right. Now, some of the research we looked at also talked about LLMs acting as meta-optimizers. What's that all about?
Oh, that's a fascinating avenue of research. The idea here is that ICL might actually involve the model doing some kind of implicit optimization internally.
Optimization, like it's optimizing its own internal workings based on the examples we give it.
Yes, precisely. It's like the model has learned how to learn, and it's using that ability to adapt to the task at hand.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing.
It is, isn't it? Some researchers even think there might be a connection between the transformer's attention mechanism and the way traditional optimization algorithms work.
Like a deep mathematical connection.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
So it's possible that the model is doing some kind of like internal gradient descent or something based on the examples.
That's one of the hypotheses, yes.
Okay, so we have this learning by analogy. We have this potential meta-optimization happening. Are there any other theories out there?
Another idea is that the examples in the prompt, they act like a retrieval queue, you know?
Retrieval queue.
Yeah, like imagine you have a massive library and you need to find a specific book.
Yep.
You use keywords to search for it,
Right.
right? Well, the examples in the prompt, they might be acting like those keywords, helping the model to find the relevant information in its own internal memory.
So it's like the model is searching its own knowledge base for information that's similar to the examples we give it.
Exactly.
So it sounds like ICL could be a combination
Mm-hmm.
of all these things, recognizing patterns, accessing existing knowledge, and even doing some kind of internal optimization, all at the same time.
That's what seems most likely. It's a complex process, and there's still a lot we don't understand about how it all works.
Yeah, definitely an area where more research is needed.
Absolutely.
Now, one thing that really caught my eye in the research was this thing called circuit shift theory.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating one.
What is that all about?
So researchers, they've been finding that sometimes in-context learning can actually do better than traditional fine-tuning.
Really? Better than fine-tuning?
Yeah, especially on tasks that involve what they call implicit patterns.
Implicit patterns. Okay, what does that mean?
So think about patterns that aren't explicitly stated as rules, but they're just kind of naturally present in the data. Like figuring out if a number is even or odd. That's a simple example of an implicit pattern.
Right, it's a pattern, but it's not like there's a written rule that says if a number is divisible by 2, it's even.
Exactly. Or like simplifying a mathematical expression. Or understanding basic logic.
Recognizing relationships between things.
Yes, all of that. Those are all examples of implicit patterns.
Okay, I get it. So how do they actually test this idea that ICL can be better for these implicit patterns?
They created several different data sets that had these kinds of implicit patterns.
Okay.
Like in math, code, logic, reasoning, all sorts of areas. And then they compared how well LLMs did on these tasks using two different methods.
Okay, so one method was in-context learning, where they gave the model a few examples in the prompt.
Right.
And the other method was fine-tuning, where they actually trained the model on a much larger set of data with labels.
Exactly.
And what did they find?
Well, this is the surprising part. They found that the models using in-context learning often did way better at picking up on these subtle patterns, and they achieved significantly higher accuracy.
Really? So even though they were only seeing a few examples, they were better than the models that were trained on a ton of data.
Yeah, it was pretty counterintuitive. In some cases, the ICL models, they had improvements of like 2% to over 30%.
Wow, that's huge. That's really surprising. You'd think that fine-tuning with all that extra training data would be the way to go.
You would think so, right? But for these implicit patterns, ICL seems to have a real edge.
So what's the explanation for this? Why is ICL better in these situations?
Well, this is where the circuit shift idea comes in. Researchers think that when you do ICL, it kind of changes the way the model processes information at a very fundamental level.
Okay.
They talk about circuits within the LLM. These are like specific pathways or subnetworks that are responsible for certain behaviors.
Okay, so it's like different parts of the model's brain that specialize in different things.
Exactly. And they used a technique called activation patching to try to figure out which parts of these circuits are most important.
Activation patching, what's that?
It's a bit technical, but basically they run the model on a normal input and they record the internal signals, the activations.
Okay.
Then they run it again on a slightly altered input.
Right.
And then in a third run, they replace some of those altered signals with the original signals.
So they're like swapping parts of the model's internal processing.
Exactly. And by seeing how much these patches affect the final output, they can figure out which parts of the network are crucial for a particular task.
Okay, that makes sense. So what did they find when they compared ICL and fine-tuning with this technique?
They found that ICL led to a much more significant circuit shift compared to fine-tuning.
A bigger shift.
Yeah, like the ICL models, they were using different parts of their circuits in a more pronounced way.
Okay, so it's not just that ICL is using a different part of the model's brain. It's that it's causing a bigger change in how that brain is wired, so to speak.
That's a great way to put it. And this shift, It seems to be especially strong when dealing with those implicit patterns.
So maybe ICL's better at recognizing those implicit patterns because it's triggering a different way of thinking, a different processing route within the model.
That's the idea.
And fine-tuning, maybe it's just not as good at doing that because it's focused on adjusting all those connections based on explicit training data.
That's the current thinking, yes.
So it's not just about seeing examples, it's about how those examples change the way the model itself thinks about the problem.
Exactly. It's like the examples are a catalyst for a fundamental shift in the model's cognitive processes.
Fascinating. This definitely changes my perspective on how powerful just a few examples can be.
I know, right? It's really remarkable.
Now, if we actually want to use in-context learning, it sounds like we need to be pretty good at crafting those prompts.
Oh, you've hit on a very important point. Prompt engineering is absolutely essential for ICL.
Yeah.
The way you structure your prompt, the examples you choose, all of that can have a huge impact on how well the model performs.
So what are some basic strategies for designing good ICL prompts?
The most basic distinction is how many examples you use.
Right.
You have zero-shot learning, where you just give the model a task description, no examples.
Right.
Then you have one-shot learning, where you give one example.
And then few-shot learning, where you give, I don't know, a handful of examples.
Exactly. A small number of relevant examples.
Okay, so let's say we're doing few-shot learning. What makes some prompts better than others?
Well, first and foremost, the quality of your examples is paramount.
Okay.
They need to be accurate, and they need to clearly demonstrate the task you want the model to perform.
So if you're teaching it to translate languages, you don't want to give it examples with grammatical errors.
Exactly. Garbage in, garbage out, as they say.
Right. What else is important?
The order in which you present those examples can also have an impact.
Really? The order matters.
It seems to, although researchers are still figuring out exactly how much. And it probably depends on the specific task and the model you're using.
Okay.
But generally speaking, having a diverse set of examples is a good idea.
Diverse.
Yeah, like examples that cover different aspects of the task or different variations.
So if you're teaching it to write different kinds of stories, you don't want to just give it examples of fairy tales.
Exactly. You want to give it a mix of genres, styles, tones, all of that.
Got it. So it's not just about throwing in a few random examples. You got to be strategic about it.
Absolutely. ICL is very sensitive to the details of your prompt.
Yeah.
Even small changes can make a big difference in the model's output.
Now, I've also come across this term, chain of thought prompting.
Yeah.
How does that fit into the ICL picture?
Chain of thought, or COT prompting. That's a really cool technique.
Okay.
It's basically a way to boost the model's reasoning abilities when you're doing ICL. So instead of just giving the model input-output examples, you also include the intermediate steps, the thought process that led to that output.
So it's like showing your work in a math problem, not just giving the final answer.
Exactly. That's a perfect analogy.
Okay, so you're basically showing the model how to think step by step.
Yes, and this seems to help the model to learn those reasoning patterns more effectively.
Interesting. Are there different ways to do COT prompting?
There are. One interesting variation is called zero-shot COT prompting.
Okay.
This is where you just add a phrase like, let's think step by step to your prompt.
And that's enough to trigger the model to start generating those intermediate steps.
Sometimes, yes. It's pretty remarkable. It's like the model has this latent ability to think step by step, and all it needs is a little nudge in the right direction.
That's amazing. Now, coming up with all these good examples for ICL and COT, it sounds like it could be a lot of work. Is there any way to automate that process?
There is. And this is where a framework called auto-ICL comes into play.
Auto-ICL. Okay.
It's designed specifically to automatically generate those demonstration examples for you.
So the AI is helping us to create the examples that will then help it to solve the problem.
It is. It's very meta, as you said earlier.
How does it actually work?
It's a two-stage process. First, it generates some contextual information, which are those demonstration examples.
Right.
And then in the second stage, it combines those generated examples with your original query to create the final prompt for the LLM.
Okay, so it's like a pre-processing step that automatically creates the best examples for the task.
Exactly. And the research has shown that auto-ICL can be very effective.
Cool. So it can save us a lot of time and effort in crafting those prompts.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And there are even templates available that outline the auto-ICL process.
Excellent. Now, with all this power and flexibility, are there any limitations or downsides to ICL that we should be aware of?
Of course. Every technology has its trade-offs.
Right.
One of the biggest challenges with ICL is efficiency. When you include a bunch of examples in your prompt, you're sending a lot more tokens to the model.
Right. More data.
And that means higher costs, potentially, and longer processing times.
Because the model has to process all that extra information.
Yeah.
What about the number of examples? Can we just keep adding more and more examples and get better and better results?
Unfortunately, no. There are limits.
Okay.
First of all, there's a maximum length for any given prompt, right? Because of the token limits.
Right.
So you can't just add an infinite number of examples.
Okay, there's a physical limit.
Exactly. And also, the research has shown that the benefits of adding more examples, they tend to plateau at some point.
So there's a sweet spot.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. And in some cases, adding too many examples can actually hurt performance.
Really? Too much of a good thing.
It seems that way, yes.
Okay.
The model can get overwhelmed or confused if you give it too much information.
I see. So what's a good rule of thumb for the number of examples?
Starting with under 8 examples is a good starting point.
Under 8. Okay. What other limitations should we keep in mind?
Well, as we've already discussed, ICL is very sensitive to the specific examples you choose.
Right.
The quality, the
Yeah.
order, the diversity, all of that matters. So it can be a bit brittle in that sense.
It's not just a set it and forget it kind of thing.
Definitely not. It requires careful thought and experimentation to get the best results.
Okay. What else?
Also, and this is a big one, we still don't fully understand how ICL actually works at a fundamental level.
Right. We talked about those different theories, but there's still a lot of mystery there.
Exactly. And that makes it harder to predict and control the model's behavior in all situations. We don't have that complete theoretical understanding yet.
Yeah. It's still early days for this technology.
It is, and that's what makes it so exciting. There's so much more to learn and discover.
Now, all the research we've discussed so far, it's mostly focused on text-based ICL, right? What about applying ICL to other types of data, like images or audio?
That's a great question, and it's a very active area of research. So we're seeing a lot of progress in applying ICL to visual data.
Okay.
For example, researchers are using masked autoencoders, or MAEs, for tasks like image inpainting or segmentation.
So like filling in missing parts of an image or identifying different objects in an image.
Exactly. And there are some really cool models out there like Paintbrush and SedGPT that are using ICL for these kinds of tasks.
Very cool.
And then there's Prompt Diffusion, which is using ICL for text-guided image generation.
So you give it a text prompt and it generates an image based on that prompt.
Yep, pretty impressive stuff.
What about combining vision and language? Is there any work being done in that area?
Absolutely. Multimodal ICL is a hot topic right now.
Okay.
Models like Frozen and Flamingo, they're showing a lot of promise in this area. They're being trained on massive data sets of image caption pairs, and they're able to do some really interesting things like generating descriptions of images or answering questions about images.
That's really cool. What about audio?
Audio ICL is a bit further behind, but there's definitely some interesting work happening there too.
Okay.
For example, researchers are exploring the use of ICL for text-to-speech synthesis.
So you give it some text and it generates the corresponding audio.
Exactly. And they're doing this by treating audio as a kind of language, using audio codec codes to represent the sounds. There's a really interesting framework for this by Wang et al. From 2023.
And they're able to get good results with this approach.
Yeah, it's still early days, but the results are promising. And they've even extended this framework to multilingual scenarios with a model called Valet X.
Very cool. So it sounds like ICL is really starting to branch out beyond just text-based tasks.
It is, and I think we're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
Now, here's a more philosophical question that came up in some of the research, specifically the Prompt Hub blog. Is in-context learning really true learning?
Ah, the age-old debate.
What's the general consensus in the machine learning community?
It's a bit divided, honestly. Some people argue that because ICL doesn't involve updating the model's parameters, it's not really learning in the traditional sense.
Right, because the model itself isn't changing.
Exactly. They say it's more like a very sophisticated form of pattern matching.
Okay, I can see that point of view.
But then other people say, hey, the model is clearly adapting to new tasks. It's using those examples to guide its behavior. That's a form of learning.
So it's learning by analogy, as we discussed earlier.
Precisely. And they argue that this kind of learning, it's actually very similar to how humans learn new things.
Right. We don't rewire our brains every time we learn something new.
Exactly. So it really comes down to how you define learning.
Fair enough. Maybe it's not worth getting hung up on the semantics as long as the model is able to achieve the desired outcome.
Exactly. Whether we call it true learning or not, the fact is that ICL is a powerful capability that allows us to do some amazing things with LLMs.
Absolutely. So what are some of the real-world applications of ICL that are starting to emerge?
We're seeing some really exciting applications in various areas.
Okay.
For example, in data engineering, ICL can be used to generate labeled data.
So instead of having humans manually label data, we can use ICL to do it automatically.
Exactly. And this can save a lot of time and money, especially when you're dealing with large data sets.
Makes sense. What other applications are there?
Another area is model augmentation.
Okay.
So you can use ICL to enhance other AI systems, like retrieval augmented generation systems.
Those are the systems that can access external knowledge sources, right?
Exactly. You can use ICL to help those systems to find more relevant information and to provide better answers.
Cool.
And you can also use ICL to guide models to produce safer outputs.
Safer.
Yeah, like less biased, less toxic, more aligned with human values.
So it's like a way to steer the model in a more ethical direction.
Exactly.
And you mentioned knowledge updating as well.
Yes, that's another promising application.
Okay.
So as we know, LLMs are trained on massive data sets of text and code. And that data, it can become outdated or incorrect over time.
Yeah, the world is constantly changing.
Exactly. But with ICL, we can potentially update the model's knowledge without having to retrain it from scratch.
So we can give it new information, and it can incorporate that information into its existing knowledge base.
Precisely.
That's really powerful. So it sounds like ICL has the potential to revolutionize the way we interact with and use LLMs.
I think so too. It's a very flexible and adaptable technology, and we're just starting to explore its full potential.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into in-context learning. We've learned so much.
We have.
We've talked about how ICL works, or at least the current theories about how it works.
Right, that learning by analogy, the meta-optimization, the retrieval queue idea, and the whole circuit shift phenomenon.
We've discussed the importance of prompt engineering and the